The night Marcus Webb turned 18, his stepfather changed the locks. Not metaphorically. Not as a warning. He literally waited until Marcus came home from his dishwashing shift at the diner, still smelling of grease and bleach, his sneakers soaked through from a busted drainage pipe near the back sink, and stood in the doorway of the house Marcus had lived in since he was 9 years old, holding a small cardboard box. Inside it were a few folded shirts, a phone charger, a photograph of Marcus's late mother, and the battered copy of a nature almanac she used to read to him before she got sick. "You're 18 now," his stepfather, Gerald, said. "You're on your own." Marcus stood on that front step for what felt like a full minute before he could speak. The November air in Hartwell County, Tennessee was already cold, the kind that bites at the corners of your eyes and settles into the joints of your fingers. He was wearing a thin denim jacket. He had $43 in his wallet. "Where am I supposed to go?" Gerald shrugged, the way someone shrugs when a question genuinely doesn't concern them. "That's not my problem anymore." The door closed. The deadbolt turned. And just like that, Marcus Webb, a boy who had done nothing wrong except be born to a woman who died too early, was standing on a concrete step in the dark with everything he owned in a shoebox. What Gerald didn't know, what none of them knew, was that inside that battered almanac his mother had tucked something away years before she died. A folded piece of paper. Marcus hadn't even noticed it yet. That paper was going to change everything. But first, Marcus had to survive the winter. Get ready, because what happens next will make you want to call someone you love. If you've ever been told you're not worth the effort, if someone you trusted packed your life into a box and handed it back to you, if you've ever stood at the bottom of a hill so steep it didn't even look real, and still had to start climbing anyway, then this story is for you. Because Marcus Webb didn't just survive what happened to him. He did something far more extraordinary than that. And the way he did it, starting with $5 and a building most people would have walked right past, is the kind of story that quietly rearranges something inside you. Stay with this until the very end. The real twist is worth every second. You have to understand who Marcus was before you can understand what made what happened to him so devastating. He was not a kid who caused trouble. He was not a kid who asked for much. From the age of 9, when his mother Diane was first diagnosed with the illness that would eventually take her, a slow, expensive, dignity-stripping battle that lasted 4 years, Marcus had learned to make himself small and useful at the same time. He learned to cook simple things, scrambled eggs, grilled cheese, pasta with butter. He learned how to run a load of laundry, how to check oil in a car, how to be quiet in the mornings when Diane needed sleep. His mother was a remarkable woman. That needs to be said clearly, because the character she built in her son didn't come from nowhere. Diane Webb had grown up in rural East Tennessee, the daughter of a man who ran a small timber operation before bad knees and harder times forced him to sell off pieces of land one by one across the 1980s. She was smart in a way that didn't always show up in grades. Sharp about people, about patterns, about what things were really worth versus what people said they were worth. She loved the outdoors with something close to reverence. She kept bird journals. She knew which berries were edible by creek beds and which ones would send you to the hospital. She also knew how to fix things. Physical things. The kind of practical, patient knowledge that gets passed down in families who can't afford to call someone every time something breaks. She taught Marcus to use a hammer by the time he was 7. She showed him how to replace a screen door, how to seal a window draft with foam tape, how to read the grain of wood before you tried to cut it. Most people just see what something looks like, she told him once, when he was maybe 10 years old. The trick is to learn what something could be. He didn't know then how much he would need those words. When Diane married Gerald Hutchins in the spring of Marcus's 9th year, the boy tried to make it work. He genuinely did. Gerald was a regional manager for a hardware distribution company, a broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s with a loud laugh and a short temper. He had 2 daughters from a previous marriage, Brianna and Carla, who were 8 and 11, and who made it clear from almost the first week that they considered Marcus a kind of inconvenient furniture in their new house. Not a brother. Not even a presence worth acknowledging. More like a stain on the carpet you'd learned to step around. Gerald was not violent. That's important. He was something subtler and in some ways harder to explain to adults who expected cruelty to look obvious. He was systematically indifferent. He took his daughters to games and never once invited Marcus along, even when Marcus stood in the driveway in his coat, keys in hand, hoping without asking. He replaced things in the house, the old couch, the dining table, the kitchen curtains, without ever consulting or including Marcus in the process, as though erasing the previous version of their family was a straightforward project he was completing. He referred to Marcus, in front of his own daughters, as your mother's son, as though Marcus belonged to a category that required a qualifier, a footnote. And when Diane got sick again, the relapse that came 3 years into the marriage, more aggressive this time, Gerald didn't become cruel exactly. He became absent. He threw himself into work. He handled the medical bills grudgingly, with the energy of a man paying a debt he felt he hadn't personally incurred. He slept in the guest room. He stopped pretending at dinner. Marcus was 12 when the second diagnosis came. He was 14 when Diane had her first surgery. He was 16 when she died, on a Tuesday morning in March, in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and plastic tubing, with Marcus holding her left hand and Gerald standing by the window checking his phone. She told Marcus something in that room, in her last days, that he held onto like a life raft in the months that followed. "You are not what happened to you," she whispered. "You are what you do with it." After Diane died, the remaining 2 years in that house were a kind of slow-motion exile. Gerald was technically fulfilling his legal obligation. Marcus was a minor in his care, but the warmth, if there had ever been any, was entirely gone. Marcus worked weekend shifts at a diner in town starting at 15. He saved money in an old tobacco tin he kept under a loose floorboard in his room. He kept his grades decent, BS mostly, a few as in anything involving science or shop class, not because he had dreams of college but because he'd decided that competence was armor. He had exactly one close friend during those years, a boy named DeMarco Tillman who lived 3 streets over and who had his own complicated family situation. They talked about music, about cars they'd never own, about places they wanted to go someday. On weekends they walked the edge of the woods outside Hartwell County just to feel like they had space that belonged to them. DeMarco was the one who first noticed the cabin, actually, though neither of them thought much about it then. Marcus graduated from Hartwell High School in June. Gerald sat through the ceremony in the 3rd row, left immediately afterward without photographs, and offered a handshake that contained no warmth at all. 2 days later, Gerald's youngest daughter Carla threw a pool party at the house. Marcus wasn't invited. He watched through the upstairs window from his room, which had already been quietly cleared of his posters in preparation for Carla's planned move-in, and understood, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, that this chapter was already over. He just didn't know the next one was going to begin with a cardboard box and $43. That night in November, the night of the locked door and the cold step, Marcus walked nearly 2 miles to the only 24-hour place in Hartwell County, a truck-stop diner on the edge of Route 41 called Patsy's, run by a stout woman in her 60s named Patsy Reeves who had inherited the place from her late husband and kept it going through sheer force of personality and excellent biscuits. Patsy was refilling coffee cups when Marcus came through the door. She looked at him once, at the thin jacket, the damp sneakers, the box under his arm, and made a decision without saying anything. She poured him a coffee without asking. She put a plate of food in front of him without charging him. And when he'd eaten and the warmth had returned to his hands, she sat down across from him in the booth and said, "What happened?" He told her all of it. Not just the night but the years before it. She listened without interrupting, which is rarer than it sounds. When he was finished, she said, "You can sleep in the storage room tonight. There's a cot back there. I'll figure out something else in the morning." That something else turned out to be a small apartment above a laundromat on Clemens Street, owned by Patsy's cousin, for $110 a month, which Marcus could only barely afford if he picked up extra hours. Patsy gave him extra hours. He had a roof. He had a mattress with a shallow dip in the center. He had a hot plate and a mini fridge the size of a suitcase. He was 18 years old and he was, technically, surviving. But surviving and living are 2 entirely different things, and Marcus Webb had enough of his mother in him to know the difference. The months that followed tested him in ways that were quiet and grinding rather than dramatic. The apartment on Clemens Street was not a bad place, exactly, but it was a place that existed at the margins of things. The laundromat beneath him ran until 10 at night, and the rumble of the machines lived in the floor like a low-grade fever. The windows faced an alley. In January, when a cold front pushed temperatures down to 11 degrees Fahrenheit, the heating unit in the apartment made a sound like someone slowly tearing cardboard and then stopped working entirely. Marcus spent 4 nights sleeping in his coat and 3 layers of socks before the landlord, Patsy's cousin, a decent but perpetually overcommit man named Roy, got someone out to fix it. He was making $9.40 an hour at the diner. After rent, he had roughly $260 a month for everything else: food, utilities, bus fare, any emergency that presented itself. He kept a notebook. He tracked every dollar with a precision that would have impressed someone twice his age. $3 for a bag of rice. $1.49 for a can of beans. He ate eggs for protein because they were cheap and filling. He drank water. He was doing his best math. But the math was very tight. What kept him grounded, what stopped the silence of those early months from caving in on him, was the almanac. After the night at Patsy's, when he'd finally settled onto that narrow cot in the storage room and opened the box just to have something familiar in his hands, he'd noticed the almanac for the first time in years. His mother's. The spine was soft from reading, the cover faded to a dull olive green. He opened it the way you open something you're not sure you're ready for, carefully, 1 page at a time. And on the 3rd night in the apartment on Clemens Street, when he was sitting on the floor because there was no chair yet and the overhead bulb was casting that flat institutional light that makes everything feel slightly hopeless, he opened the almanac again and something slipped out from between the back pages. A folded piece of paper. The fold lines had gone soft from years of pressure, as if it had been sitting in that position for a very long time. He smoothed it out on the floor. It was handwritten. His mother's handwriting, he'd know the particular slant of her lowercase letters anywhere. And what it said stopped him cold. He read it twice. Then a 3rd time. Then he sat back against the wall and stared at the water stain pattern on the ceiling for a long time without moving. He didn't understand yet what it meant in full. He wasn't sure if it was real, or if he was misreading something, or if it was the kind of thing that looked significant and turned out to be nothing. He carefully folded the paper and put it back in the almanac. Then he slept. But over the next 3 weeks, the paper was all he thought about. Before he could follow the thread of what was in that note, Marcus had more immediate problems. February arrived with the specific cruelty of a second winter that doesn't feel like it should still be happening. Marcus had picked up a second job by then, 3 mornings a week stocking shelves at a small grocery 2 blocks from the laundromat, starting at 5 a.m., which meant waking at 4:15 in the dark and walking through air that felt like it had teeth. His hands cracked. He went through a tube of drugstore hand cream every 2 weeks. He kept the receipt. It was DeMarco, his old friend from the neighborhood, who came through when it mattered. DeMarco had a truck, an old but functional F-150 that needed coaxing on cold mornings, and a practical nature that made him good in a crisis. He started driving Marcus to the grocery job on mornings when the temperature dropped below 20. He didn't charge him. He just showed up. This is the kind of thing that matters more than people realize. Not a grand gesture, just a quiet repeated presence in someone else's dark stretch of road. "You're going to be all right," DeMarco said one morning, idling outside the grocery in the blue-black pre-dawn, the heater blowing warm against Marcus's hands. "You know that, right?" "I know that," Marcus said, though on some mornings he had to choose to believe it rather than feel it. By March, something had shifted in Marcus's thinking. He was not going to be able to build anything on what he had right now, not on $9.40 an hour at a diner and early morning grocery shifts and a $110 apartment over a laundromat. The math of surviving was consuming every resource he had, leaving nothing over for the math of building. He needed a different kind of starting point. That's when the cabin came back into his mind. He and DeMarco had walked past it dozens of times in their high school years, an old log structure that sat on a piece of overgrown property about a mile off Painter Creek Road, northeast of town, set back in the trees like something the forest was slowly reclaiming. It had been empty as long as either of them could remember. The logs were dark and weathered. One corner of the porch had collapsed inward. The windows were mostly intact but thick with grime. Somebody had spray-painted something on the door years ago that had long since faded to an unintelligible shadow. "That thing's going to fall down one day," DeMarco had said once, probably when they were 16. And Marcus had laughed and agreed. But Marcus had also noticed things about it that he hadn't been able to articulate then. The bones of it were solid. The logs were tight at the joints, none of the visible sagging or twisting that suggested rot in the structural members. The chimney was intact. The pitch of the roof looked sound from the outside. It sat on elevated ground, which meant drainage wasn't a problem. He'd known this without knowing he knew it, the way you absorb things from a parent who teaches through doing rather than explaining. He went back to look at it in March. Alone this time, early on a Sunday morning, in the pale gold light that comes through bare trees in early spring. He walked the perimeter slowly. He pressed his palm against the log walls in several places. He found the gaps where chinking had loosened and fallen out, which was normal and fixable. He looked at the foundation, a poured concrete slab that had settled slightly on one end but was otherwise intact. He pulled gently on the porch railing and found it loose but not hopeless. He stood in front of that cabin for a long time. Then he asked around about who owned it. That turned out to be a longer trail than he expected. The property had passed through 3 sets of hands over 4 decades, most recently to an elderly man named Earl Pryor who'd inherited it from his brother and wanted nothing to do with it. He lived in Knoxville, was 81 years old, and had been trying intermittently to sell the property for years with no takers because the access road was poor, the cabin needed significant work, and the parcel itself was a strange, irregular shape that made developers uninterested. Marcus found Earl Pryor through the county property records, something he'd had to ask the county clerk twice to explain to him, and called him from the diner on his break, using the diner's landline. Earl answered on the 4th ring. His voice was thin and dry, the voice of a man who'd stopped expecting good news from phone calls. Marcus explained who he was, that he was 18, that he had almost no money, that he'd looked at the cabin and believed it was structurally reparable, and that he wanted to offer something for it. There was a long silence on the line. "Son," Earl said finally, "what on earth are you offering?" $5, Marcus said. "And I'll pay the back property taxes. They're $412. Another silence. Longer this time. "Why $5? "Because that's what I have left after rent this week. But I can pay the taxes in installments over the next 4 months. I can put it in writing." Earl Pryor laughed. It was a real laugh, not unkind. The laugh of a man genuinely surprised by something. "What are you planning to do with it?" "Live in it," Marcus said. "And fix it up." Earl accepted. Marcus was never entirely sure why, whether it was the absurd earnestness of the offer, or whether Earl had simply decided he didn't care about the money and just wanted the property off his hands and in the care of someone who would actually do something with it. They drew up a simple contract. Marcus typed it himself on a library computer, using a basic legal template he found online, and Earl signed it and mailed it back. The deed transfer took 6 weeks through the county recorder's office and cost Marcus $41 in filing fees. He paid it in cash. On a Saturday in April, with DeMarco's truck loaded with cleaning supplies, tools borrowed from Patsy's cousin Roy, and a set of second-hand work gloves, Marcus drove out to Painter Creek Road for the first time as the owner of something. The inside of the cabin was rough. That needs to be said honestly. The floor was gritty with years of wind-blown debris and something that had clearly lived and died in one corner. The wood-burning stove in the main room was seized with rust. The single bedroom off the main space had a collapsed section of ceiling where a branch had apparently come down in a storm at some point, tearing through the roof boards. The kitchen, if you could call it that, was a small alcove with a rusted hand pump and a counter so warped it had lifted completely free of the wall. DeMarco stood in the middle of the main room, turning slowly, and said nothing for a very long time. "Say it," Marcus told him. "I wasn't going to say anything." "You were going to say something." DeMarco scratched the back of his neck. "I was going to say it has good bones." Marcus laughed for the first time in what felt like weeks. They started that day. First they cleared debris. Then they assessed damage. Then Marcus made a list. A careful, prioritized list of what needed to happen and in what order, because doing things out of sequence in a renovation is how you redo work twice and waste money you don't have. Roof first, because everything inside was hostage to the weather. Then the stove and chimney, because he'd need heat. Then the floor, the walls, the window seals. He was going to be living in the apartment on Clemens Street for a while longer, working and saving, doing cabin work on weekends and any day off he could manage. He estimated, conservatively, that the cabin would be livable in 6 to 8 months. He was wrong about the timeline, not because he was naive, but because the complications that come with old structures have a way of stacking up like kindling. The roof repair alone took 6 weekends and cost more than he'd budgeted, because once he got up there and pulled back the damaged section, he found that the rot had spread farther than the visible damage suggested. It had wicked in from the edges during years of improper drainage, turning the decking boards soft and spongy in a roughly 40 square foot area. He had to replace nearly 60 square feet of decking before he could put down new underlayment and shingles. He bought the materials from Roy's hardware store account, paying Roy back in installments. He did every bit of the labor himself. He learned by doing. He made mistakes and corrected them. He watched instructional videos on a borrowed tablet, sitting in the parking lot of the library to use their Wi-Fi late at night, taking notes in the same spiral notebook where he tracked his grocery spending. He called a retired contractor named Phil Burrow who ran a woodworking class at the county community center, and who agreed, after meeting Marcus twice and assessing him as someone serious and not stupid, to come out to the cabin on 2 Saturday mornings and walk him through the parts he was most uncertain about: the chimney flashing, the load-bearing beam above the bedroom ceiling, the proper sequence for replacing the chinking in the log walls. You know what most people don't understand about old cabins? Phil told him one morning, running a hand along the inside of the main room wall, the logs going a deep amber in the morning light. They were built to last. People now, they build things fast and cheap. These logs were cut green and they dried in place. That's why they're still standing 100 years later. You're not rescuing this cabin. You're just removing whatever got in the way of it being itself. Marcus wrote that down too. By June, the roof was sound. By the end of July, the stove was cleaned, the flue was swept and tested, and the hearth fire Marcus lit on a warm evening sent orange light trembling across the newly swept log walls in a way that made him sit down on an overturned milk crate and feel, for the first time in a very long time, something that wasn't exhaustion or worry or the low hum of scarcity. It felt like possibility. And it was at that precise moment, sitting in that orange light on a warm July evening, the almanac open in his lap because he'd started carrying it to the cabin as a kind of talisman, that he opened it again to the folded paper and let himself truly read it. He'd been circling it for months. Half reading it in the apartment, telling himself he'd deal with it properly when things were more stable, when he had more bandwidth, when he wasn't so consumed with survival. But here, in the cabin his mother had somehow helped him reach, even from years past her death, he read it again. Carefully. All of it. His mother had written the note sometime in the last year of her life, when she must have known she was running out of time to say things directly. Her handwriting was shakier than he remembered it. She'd had tremors in the last year, but the words were clear. She wrote that her father, Marcus's grandfather, the man who'd run the timber operation and sold off parcels of land through the 1980s, had not sold everything. She wrote that there was a piece of land he'd held back, a particular parcel that had something specific on it that he'd never been willing to part with, and that he'd put it in a trust that was supposed to pass eventually to her, and then to Marcus when he came of age. She believed the trust was still active, that it had never been properly dissolved or transferred, but that in the years of illness and crisis she had never managed to follow through on confirming it. She wrote, "The land is in Callaway Hollow. Your grandfather called it the old survey parcel. There should be records. Find the records, Marcus. Whatever you do, find the records." And she wrote something else at the bottom of the page, in handwriting so small he had to hold the paper close to the lamp to read it. "The value isn't in the timber. Not anymore. Look at what's underneath." He didn't know what that meant. Not yet. He sat with the note until the lamp oil ran low and the orange light thinned to amber and the cabin settled around him in the quiet of a Tennessee summer night. He was going to have to find out. Callaway Hollow was a real place. He knew that much. It was a rural pocket in the northeastern corner of Hartwell County, maybe 12 miles from the cabin, a narrow valley between two low ridges where a few old homesteads had sat for generations. But Marcus didn't know those roads, and he didn't know what, specifically, he was looking for, and he was a 19-year-old with a diner job and a partially renovated cabin who had never navigated a land trust before in his life. He started where his mother had told him to start, the records. The Hartwell County Register of Deeds was on the second floor of the county courthouse, in a room that smelled of old paper and institutional carpet, staffed by a patient middle-aged woman named Donna who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and who was, it turned out, deeply knowledgeable about historic land records and, more importantly, perfectly willing to explain them to a young man with a handwritten note from his dead mother. It took 2 visits and several hours of looking through physical ledgers and digitized records before they found it. A trust instrument filed in 1987 by Marcus's grandfather, Edgar Harlan Webb. The trust named 2 beneficiaries in sequence, first Diane Webb and then, upon her death, any surviving children of Diane Webb over the age of 18. Marcus was 19 years old. Donna looked at him over her reading glasses when they found it. "Well," she said, "you may want to call a lawyer." He called 3 before he found one who would take a preliminary meeting for free. Her name was Sarah Carver, a property and estate attorney in Knoxville who had a no-frills office above a dry cleaner's and a reputation, according to county court records Marcus found online, for handling rural land disputes with both competence and a lack of drama. She was in her late 30s, direct, and not given to encouraging false hope. She listened to Marcus's account, read the note, reviewed the photocopies of the trust documents from the county records, and said, "This is potentially real." I want to be clear that potentially is doing real work in that sentence. Trust instruments from the 1980s that haven't been administered are messy. There may be complications. There may be other claimants. There may be issues with the trust's legal status after this many years. But it could be real, Marcus said. "It could be real," she confirmed. "Let me do some digging. I'll need a retainer." He didn't have money for a retainer. That's not a dramatic understatement. He genuinely did not have the several $100s she would normally require. He told her so honestly. She looked at him for a moment across her desk. "I'll work on contingency," she said finally. "If the trust holds and there's something in it, I take 15% of the value of any assets recovered. If it's nothing, we both walk away." He shook her hand. He drove back to Hartwell County in DeMarco's truck. DeMarco had insisted on coming, had sat in the waiting area of Sarah Carver's office reading a 3-year-old magazine without complaint, and they stopped at a gas station on the way home and Marcus bought 2 hot dogs from the rotating rack near the register. They ate them in the parking lot in the October afternoon light. "So what happens now?" DeMarco asked. "We wait," Marcus said. "We work. We keep fixing the cabin." He moved into the cabin that month. It was livable now. Not finished, not comfortable in a conventional sense, but livable. He had the stove. He had a salvaged couch from a roadside pile that he'd cleaned and recushioned. He had a cot from a camping supply discount store. He had running water, because the old hand pump had been connected to a cistern that he'd cleaned and refilled, and which, he'd had someone from the county extension office check, had clean water. He gave up the apartment on Clemens Street. He thanked Roy for his patience. Roy gave him a small box of leftover trim pieces and a handshake. The first night in the cabin alone, with the fire going and the wind in the trees outside and the absolute dark of rural Tennessee all around him, Marcus sat on the couch with the almanac and read the note one more time. The last line. "Look at what's underneath." He didn't know yet, but Sarah Carver was looking. The call came on a Thursday afternoon in late November, exactly 1 year after Gerald Hutchins had changed the locks on the front door of the house on Margrave Street. Marcus was at the diner, in the middle of a lunch shift, when his phone buzzed. He stepped into the back hallway near the storage room, the same room where Patsy had let him sleep the night everything fell apart, and answered it. "Marcus," Sarah Carver said. "Are you sitting down?" "Standing," he said. "Sit down." He sat on an appended milk crate in the back hallway of Patsy's diner and listened while Sarah Carver told him what she'd found. The trust was valid. The documentation was clean. Edgar Webb had been meticulous, unusual for a rural land trust of that era, Sarah said, but apparently his grandfather had worked with a careful attorney in Knoxville whose paperwork had survived intact through the county records. The trust had never been dissolved, had never been legally challenged, and had been in a state of suspended dormancy since Diane's death 3 years earlier, waiting for a beneficiary over 18 to claim it. The parcel in Callaway Hollow was approximately 38 acres. But that wasn't the part that made Marcus's hands stop working properly. The part that did that was when Sarah Carver said, as calmly as someone reading a grocery list, "A geological survey conducted in 2019 by a regional energy company, one of 3 companies that apparently approached your grandfather's estate and received no response because no one knew the trust was active, found a high-probability natural gas deposit under the western portion of the parcel. Conservative estimates put the development value at somewhere between $1.2 and $2.8 million, depending on the extraction deal negotiated." The back hallway of Patsy's diner was quiet except for the sound of the kitchen and the faint noise of the lunch crowd. "Are you there?" Sarah asked. "I'm here," Marcus said. His voice came out smaller than he expected. "There's more." The survey also identified a freshwater spring on the upper portion of the parcel that feeds into a tributary of Painter Creek. In the current regulatory environment, that spring has significant legal value as a protected water source. A conservation easement on that portion alone could be worth considerable money to the Wright Nonprofit Land Trust. Marcus pressed his back against the wall of the hallway. 1.2 to 2.8 million, he repeated. "At minimum," Sarah said. "This is a number we would verify exhaustively before proceeding. I want to be very clear that we are at the beginning of a process. But yes, Marcus, the asset is real. Your grandfather held onto something that just got more valuable while it sat there." He thought of the last line of his mother's note. Look at what's underneath. She had known. Not the specifics, not the gas survey, not the spring valuation, but she had known that the land held something that wasn't visible from the surface. He had always thought of her as someone who saw what things could be. He understood now that she had been leaving him a path, the only way she could, from wherever she was going. He sat in that hallway for a long time before he went back to his shift. He didn't tell anyone that day. Not Patsy, not DeMarco. He carried it alone for 24 hours, turning it over, trying to feel the shape of it, making sure he hadn't misunderstood. Then he called DeMarco and told him, and DeMarco said nothing for so long that Marcus checked to see if the call had dropped. "You're serious?" DeMarco finally said. "I'm serious." Another pause. Then, "Your mom knew." "My mom knew," Marcus said. What followed was not immediate. This is the part of stories like this that movies always skip, the months of careful, patient, often tedious process that stand between a discovery and the life on the other side of it. Sarah Carver was thorough and methodical. She ordered independent verification of the geological survey. She brought in a second attorney who specialized in mineral rights to review the trust instrument and confirm its applicability to subsurface assets, which, it turned out, it covered, because Marcus's grandfather had been advised in 1987 to include surface and subsurface rights in the same instrument, and the attorney who'd drawn up the paperwork had done exactly that. 3 energy companies were contacted. 2 expressed interest. Negotiations were slow and required multiple rounds. Sarah negotiated hard on Marcus's behalf. The spring on the upper portion of the property was assessed by a conservation nonprofit based in Knoxville that specialized in protecting Appalachian water sources, and they made an offer for a conservation easement that was lower than Sarah's initial estimate but still substantial. All told, it took 11 months from the November phone call to the final signing. During those 11 months, Marcus continued working. He continued fixing the cabin. He got better at it, actually. The work became something more than survival necessity and started to become craft. He replaced the warped kitchen counter with one he built himself from salvaged white oak planks he'd sourced from a sawmill owner outside of town who'd taken a liking to him. He rebuilt the collapsed section of the bedroom ceiling, matching the original board dimensions so well that Phil Burrow, who came to inspect the work, had to stand very close to the junction to tell which boards were original and which were new. Phil told him, "You have a real skill for this." Marcus said, "My mom taught me." Sort of. He meant it. Every bit of practical knowledge he'd brought to that cabin. the patience with materials, the eye for what was structurally honest, the willingness to do things slowly and correctly rather than quickly and approximately, all of it came from Diane Webb in ways direct and indirect. He thought about that a lot during those months. About how the things people give us don't always arrive in the form we expect, and don't always reveal themselves on any kind of schedule we can plan for. He kept the note in the almanac. He kept the almanac on a shelf he'd built beside the hearth. In the fall of that year, about 8 months into the legal process and 3 months before it concluded, Marcus was at the county courthouse for a routine records check when he ran into Gerald Hutchins. It was unplanned, completely coincidental. Gerald was there for something unrelated, some business matter, and Marcus came around the corner near the Register of Deeds office and they were suddenly 6 feet apart in a linoleum-floored hallway under fluorescent lights. Gerald looked older, more tired. The broad-shouldered authority Marcus remembered had softened in a way that made him look somehow smaller. He was wearing a dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, carrying a manila folder. He stopped when he saw Marcus. The silence lasted several seconds. Marcus looked at him, this man who had handed him a box in the cold and closed a door, and felt something he hadn't entirely anticipated, not rage, not grief, just a quiet, grounded stillness. Like someone who has walked far enough from a thing to finally see its full shape. Marcus, Gerald said. It came out uncertain. Like a man who'd rehearsed something and then realized the room was different than he'd imagined. Gerald, Marcus said. Another silence. I heard you bought a piece of property, Gerald said carefully. Out past Painter Creek Road. I did, Marcus said. Gerald nodded slowly. There was something in his face that might have been the beginning of something he wanted to say, some reaching gesture, but Marcus didn't need it. He didn't need the apology that might or might not have been forming in that hallway. He had found the note. He had fixed the cabin. He had survived the winter and the one after it, and he had built something with his own hands out of something most people had written off. He said, "Take care of yourself, Gerald." He walked past him and down the hall and out the courthouse doors into the October sunlight, and he breathed the cool air and did not look back. That was enough. That was, in fact, exactly enough. The final signing happened on a Friday in October, in Sarah Carver's No Frills office above the dry cleaners in Knoxville. 2 transactions. The mineral rights development deal with the energy company that had come in with the stronger offer, and the conservation easement for the spring and the upper parcel with the Appalachian Watershed Trust. Sarah had negotiated well. She had earned her 15% without question. The total, after her fee and the legal costs, came to a number that Marcus read on the final document 3 times before it felt real. He called DeMarco from the parking lot. "It's done," he said. DeMarco's voice, when he responded, had something in it that was harder to name than happiness. Something more like vindication, the particular emotion of watching someone you believe in be proven right. "What are you going to do now?" he asked. Marcus looked at his truck, not DeMarco's F-150 anymore but his own, a used but solid pickup he'd bought 3 months earlier with money he'd saved, and thought about the cabin, which was mostly finished now, sitting on its elevated ground in the trees off Painter Creek Road with its new roof and its working stove and its white oak kitchen counter and its hearth fire and the almanac on the shelf beside it. "I'm going to finish the cabin," he said. "Properly. And then I'm going to do it again." The thing Marcus understood, in the year that followed, was that the money was not the transformation. The money was the confirmation. The transformation had already happened, slowly, invisibly, across cold mornings and steep hours and stubborn choices made in hallways and back rooms and overgrown properties that everyone else had passed by. He did finish the cabin properly. He poured a new foundation extension for a small workshop he built on the east side. He installed a wood stove in the bedroom. He rebuilt the porch completely, not just replaced the collapsed corner but rebuilt the whole thing in cedar, with a railing he turned himself on a used lathe he bought from an estate sale. He planted a kitchen garden on the south-facing slope that DeMarco helped him fence one Saturday in spring, and where, by early summer, he had tomatoes and herbs and runner beans climbing wooden poles his mother would have recognized. He kept working at Patsy's for a while, not because he had to anymore, but because Patsy had been there on the night everything fell apart, and loyalty to that fact mattered to him. He stayed until Patsy found someone to replace his hours without a gap, and then he said goodbye with a long hug in the kitchen and a paper bag of biscuits she pressed into his hands. He used a portion of the settlement to buy a second property, a rundown farmhouse on 4 acres that had sat vacant for 2 years on the outskirts of Hartwell County. He spent 7 months on it, doing the same patient, methodical work he'd done on the cabin, learning as he went, making it livable and then beautiful and then marketable. He sold it for considerably more than he'd paid and the costs of repair combined. He reinvested the profit. This was not a business plan, exactly. It was the continuation of something that had always been true about Marcus Webb. He knew how to see what something could be. He hired DeMarco to help with the second property. And the third. DeMarco turned out to have a natural aptitude for electrical work and plumbing, areas where Marcus had always been less confident, and the combination of their skills made them faster and more capable than either had been alone. They registered in LC, Webb and Tillman Property Renovation, with $100 in filing fees at the same county courthouse where Marcus had found the trust records. The name felt right in a way that made both of them grin a little. He bought a better truck. He bought a proper set of tools. Not borrowed, not secondhand, but good tools that he put in order on a pegboard in the workshop and maintained the way you maintain things you intend to keep. He did not buy a large house or expensive things, or any of the other signals people reach for when they want the world to know the story of their elevation. He didn't need the world to know. He knew. And the cabin knew. And the almanac on the shelf by the hearth knew, in whatever way objects that carry the weight of people's lives retain some echo of what they meant. He visited Callaway Hollow once, not long after the signing, on a cool afternoon with low cloud cover and the smell of wet leaves in the air. He walked the 38 acres slowly, along the ridge and down to the spring where clean water came up through limestone and ran clear over river stones in a sound so peaceful it seemed almost designed for the purpose. He thought about his grandfather Edgar, who had held onto this land through the decades that stripped away everything else, for reasons he probably couldn't have articulated beyond a stubborn feeling that it was worth holding. He thought about his mother, who had left him a note in a battered almanac because it was the best she could do from the place she was going. He thought, they planted something. They didn't know when it would grow. They just made sure the ground was right. He stood by the spring for a long time. Then he walked back through the trees to his truck and drove home. Gerald Hutchins did not come to ruin, exactly. Life is not always tidy enough for that. But within 2 years of the night he'd handed Marcus a cardboard box, his hardware distribution company had been absorbed in a regional merger that eliminated his management position. His youngest daughter, Carla, moved to Nashville and stopped calling. Brianna, the elder, got married and relocated to Georgia. Gerald rattled around in the house on Margrave Street, the house Marcus had grown up in, with his routines and his diminished circumstances and whatever he chose to make of the space where a family had once been. People in Hartwell County talked, as people in small counties do. Marcus heard things secondhand, through Patsy, through Roy, through the ordinary channels of a small community's information flow. He didn't respond to any of it. He had nothing to add to those conversations. He had made his peace in a fluorescent-lit county courthouse hallway on an October afternoon, and that peace had held. What Gerald couldn't undo, couldn't reclaim, couldn't even properly understand, was what had grown from the thing he'd thrown away. He'd thought he was ending something. He'd handed Marcus a box and closed a door and completed what he believed was a transaction with no further consequences. But you can't throw away a seed and expect the ground to stay bare. Some things, when they're planted, even by accident, even in cruelty, even in the coldest kind of November darkness, take root in ways nobody intended and nobody can predict. They go down deep, into ground nobody's looked at in decades, finding what's underneath. And then one day the person who did the throwing looks over, and there's something standing there that they will never fully understand. Marcus didn't need them to understand. He had the cabin. He had the workshop. He had his friend and his partner and the business they were building one careful renovation at a time. He had the almanac on the shelf, and the spring on the Callaway Hollow land, and the note in his mother's handwriting that he would keep until he was old.